You've heard a ton about plastic pollution, right? But what if I told you the biggest part of the problem is completely invisible? So today, we're going to dive deep into what a massive review of over 200 scientific papers tells us about microplastics. You know, those tiny particles that have been found, and I mean literally everywhere on Earth. So what do we really know? Okay, let's just start with a number. A big one. 12.7 million. So what is that? Well, that's the high-end estimate for metric tons of the plastic waste we can actually see. You know, the bottles, the bags, the packaging, all of it entering our oceans just from coastal countries every single year. And yeah, that number is absolutely massive, but believe it or not, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. I mean, what happens when all that big stuff breaks down? And what about all the plastic that's made to be tiny right from the get-go? Yeah, this is where the whole story of microplastics really begins.
All right, so let's get on the same page. What are we actually talking about here? Well, the official scientific definition is pretty simple. It's any plastic particle that's smaller than 5 millimeters. To give you some perspective, that's about the size of a single grain of rice, all the way down to specks you literally can't see with the naked eye. And it turns out they come from two totally different sources. First up, you've got what are called primary microplastics. These are the ones that are manufactured to be tiny from the start. Think about those little microbeads they used to put in cosmetics, for example. But honestly, the vast majority are what we call secondary microplastics. These start out as something much bigger, like a plastic bottle. Over time, it just gets hammered by sunlight and waves, it gets brittle, and eventually it just shatters into a million tiny little pieces.
Okay, so if we want to understand this whole global mess, we really have to start where the scientists started, and that's in the ocean. For decades, the marine environment has been ground zero for researchers trying to wrap their heads around this problem.
And you can see right here just how focused on the ocean our knowledge has been. I mean, according to this review, a whopping 70% of all microplastic research has been on the seas. And, you know, it makes sense, right? That's where we first saw those huge, shocking things like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, things that made the problem totally impossible to ignore. And the sheer scale of what's out there, it's almost impossible to comprehend. One of the major studies in this review came up with an estimate. They think there are at least, get this, 5.25 trillion plastic particles just floating around in the world's oceans. And look, these trillions of particles, they're not just hanging out on the surface. Nope. Scientists have found them pretty much everywhere they've looked. They're mixed all through the water column, they've settled in the deepest parts of the ocean, they're literally frozen into the Arctic ice, and, maybe most disturbingly, they've been found inside the guts of over 220 different marine species, from the tiniest zooplankton all the way up to whales. So you might be wondering, what is all this stuff? We probably all picture little fragments of bottles or bags, right? But the review points to a culprit that's actually way more surprising: fibers. Yep, a lot of the time, the most common type of microplastics they find are tiny fibers from our clothes. Every single time we do a load of laundry with synthetic stuff like polyester or nylon, thousands of these little strands just break off and wash right down the drain. Okay, but hold on a second. If most plastic floats, how in the world does it end up at the bottom of the deep sea? Well, the answer is this really fascinating process called biofouling. Basically, little tiny things like algae and microbes start to grow all over the surface of the plastic. It's like they're colonizing it. And all that life adds weight. Eventually, the particle gets just heavy enough that it's denser than the water and it starts to sink, beginning this long, slow journey down to the ocean floor. But here's the thing. The story absolutely does not end in the ocean. In fact, if there's one thing this huge scientific review makes crystal clear, it's that the ocean is really just the final destination, the end of the line for a problem that actually starts almost everywhere else. And that journey to the ocean? It starts in our rivers. Yeah, you can think of rivers as the main highways for plastic pollution. They collect all the runoff from enormous areas of land, and according to some estimates, they carry something like 70 to 80% of all the plastic that eventually makes it into the sea. They're like a giant conveyor belt. Which, of course, brings us to the real source of so much of this: the land itself. Just check this out for a second. Scientists estimate that as much as 850 tons of microplastics are added to farmland every single year for every million people just from using treated sewage sludge as fertilizer. And think about what's in that sludge. It's packed with all those fibers from our laundry, plus particles from pretty much everything else that goes down our drains. And maybe the most mind-blowing pathway of all, it's not just in our water, it's not just in our soil, it's in the very air we breathe.
That's right. These tiny, lightweight fibers from our clothes, from carpets, even from the wear and tear on our car tires, they get kicked up into the air and can travel for incredible distances. It's wild. One study estimated that somewhere between 3 and 10 tons of these fibers just fall out of the sky onto the city of Paris alone, every year.
So when you put it all together, what this review is really screaming at us is that we absolutely cannot think of these as separate issues. This isn't just an ocean problem or a soil problem or an air problem. It's one big, interconnected, global plastic cycle. So let's trace it, right? Plastic gets into the soil from all kinds of places. Then the rain comes and washes those particles into our rivers. The rivers then act like that conveyor belt, carrying it all out to the sea. And the whole time this is happening, the wind is just picking up the lightest little fibers and dust and scattering them everywhere. Like the review says, all of these environments are closely linked.
Okay, so even with everything we've learned, and it's a lot, the review is also super clear on one thing. We are just scratching the surface here. The next big frontier for science is to start tackling the huge gaps in what we know.
For instance, we're only just starting to really get how a single plastic particle's fate completely depends on where it ends up. If it's on the surface of the ocean or on land, with lots of sunlight and oxygen beating down on it, it gets brittle and breaks apart pretty fast. But take that exact same particle and bury it in cold, dark mud at the bottom of the ocean where there's no oxygen, it could just sit there almost unchanged for centuries. And that leads to the really big, tough questions that scientists are wrestling with right now. Like, how can we all agree on one standard way to sample and measure these things so a study in Asia can be compared to one in Europe? How fast does this stuff really break down out in the wild, not just in a lab? What is the actual tangible risk to ecosystems? And the biggest challenge of all, how on earth do we even begin to study nanoplastics, particles that are 1,000 times smaller than the microplastics we've been talking about? So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? The picture that science is painting is incredibly clear. We've basically left the fingerprints of our plastic age everywhere, on the entire planet. Science has done its job. It's shown us that these particles are ubiquitous. So the final, lingering question is, what does that all actually mean? For the health of the planet? And for us?